May 8, 1945. Somewhere in southern Germany. General Karl Vogel stood in front of a burning barrel, feeding classified documents into flames that turned words into ash. The villa behind him still had glass in most of its windows. His staff officers lined the gravel drive, hands raised, pistols surrendered one by one to American soldiers who looked younger than his own son. The white sheets tied to the trees fluttered in the morning breeze like flags of a country that had never existed. The young American sergeant with the Thompson submachine gun couldn't have been older than 22. He took Vogel's Luger with practiced efficiency, checked the chamber, dropped it into a canvas sack already heavy with defeated steel. An officer behind him, maybe 30, with the kind of face that had seen too much too fast, inspected Vogel's papers with careful precision. "You are General Karl Vogel?" he asked, in clipped, accented German. Vogel nodded once, spine straight despite everything. Commander of the 49th Corps. What happened next made no sense at all. The American gestured toward the road, almost politely. "You and your staff will be transported to a collection point," he said. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. If any of your men are wounded, tell my medics now." The words struck harder than artillery. Vogel knew the Geneva Convention. He knew how many times his own country had ignored it when convenient, sealing orders with eagles and wax that never mentioned mercy. The question escaped before he could stop it. "Why would you do that for us?" The young officer didn't smile. "Because that is the law," he said simply, "and because one day we may also be prisoners." In that answer, Vogel heard something that terrified him more than defeat itself. He heard a country that believed its own rules, even when no one could force it to. Karl Vogel was 52 years old, the product of 3 generations of Prussian military service. His grandfather had worn the Pickelhaube under Kaiser Wilhelm. His father had died in the mud of the Somme. He himself had risen methodically through the ruins of the old army into the new one that replaced it. He was not a fanatic, at least not in his own mind. He was a professional who believed in order, discipline, and the idea that Germany was surrounded and misunderstood and must defend itself with steel. Everything he'd been taught since his first day in uniform told him one simple truth: America was soft. Democracies argued. Democracies hesitated. Democracies did not have the stomach for real war. The propaganda ministry had made sure every German officer carried those images in his head: chaos, revenge, drunken occupation troops settling scores. Instead, he got procedure. Before we continue, if you're finding this story as gripping as we are telling it, hit that like button and subscribe to keep history alive. Drop a comment below, telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. The makeshift prisoner cage that night held hundreds of German officers sitting on their packs in the dark. Artillery rumbled east, moving away from them now. Rumors flickered like fireflies over the wire. Some said execution at dawn. Others claimed prisoner exchange. A colonel swore they'd be sent to England to answer for crimes in the East. Major Hesse, a staff officer with a talent for forbidden information, whispered the truth nobody believed. "They're taking us to America, across the ocean to camps." "Impossible," someone scoffed. "We're too many." "They have ships," Hesse said quietly. "More than we can imagine. They have space, food. They'll intern us there until they decide what to do." Vogel listened in silence, his mind automatically rearranging maps. To move thousands of prisoners across an ocean at war required escorts, fuel, coordination. It required resources Germany couldn't have spared even in its strongest year. Maybe that was precisely the point. Days later, at the rail yard, his suspicion became certainty. The freight cars weren't cattle wagons, but repurposed passenger coaches, stripped and crude, but infinitely better than the boxcars used in the East. Red Cross markings, guard checking names against lists, water and rations issued before boarding. The train journey blurred into grey days and nights. But there was one moment Karl Vogel would remember until he died. When the doors finally slid open, he expected more ruins. Bombed rail yards, collapsed bridges, smouldering towns. That's what Europe looked like in 1945. That's what war did to countries, even victorious ones. Instead, he saw color. Compared to the ash palette of Germany, the American coast seemed almost saturated. Clear, hard blue sky. Ships painted neat grey and black, orange and green cranes, no bomb craters, no burned-out wagons, no locomotive carcasses left to rust where they died. They had arrived in New York. Vogel stepped onto solid, undamaged concrete. Beyond the guards and fences rose a forest of masts and derricks, freighters, troopships, tankers, all moored side by side. Farther still, through the haze, he caught a glimpse of something he recognized even from a distance. A tall woman of copper and stone raising a torch over the bay. The Statue of Liberty. He'd seen drawings, of course. He'd read reports calling it hypocritical American propaganda, a monument to lies about freedom. Now seeing it in person, he felt something twist in his chest that he refused to name. Next to him, Major Hesse let out a low whistle. "They didn't bomb this place," he murmured. "Not once." "Out of range," Vogel said automatically. "Out of reach," Hesse corrected. "Not just of planes, of everything." The harbour wasn't quiet. Engines roared, winches squealed. Men shouted to each other in English, in accents Vogel could only half distinguish. But there was no panic in the noise. It was the chaos of work, not of fear. American military police formed a tight corridor from train to dock. They were armed, serious, efficient. They didn't yell. They used hand signals more than boots. German officers were counted, checked against lists, assigned to groups. A medic walked down the line, pausing when he saw a bandage or a limp. "Wounded to this side," he called. "They go aboard first." A wounded colonel in front of Vogel gritted his teeth. "I can walk," he said in German. "Save your pity." The medic, a freckled man who looked like he should be fixing cars back home, frowned. "Pity's not the point," he replied in accented but understandable German. "You get on board now because infection doesn't care about rank. If you fall on the stairs, you hold up everyone." Vogel watched, thinking of how German doctors had spoken to Russian prisoners in the last months of the war. There had been shouting, slapping, threats. Here a man in uniform argued back to a general and nobody shot him. On deck, the air smelled of oil and salt. The prisoners were herded below, but it wasn't the airless hole Vogel expected. Rows of iron bunks, barrels of fresh water. The latrines were crude, but they existed. No one was forced to relieve himself in a corner. An American officer addressed them through an interpreter. "You're being transported to prisoner of war camps in the United States. You'll be required to work according to the rules for officers. You'll receive medical care and food. You're expected to follow camp regulations. Any attempt to escape will be punished. Any abuse of guards or other prisoners will be punished." He paused, let the translator finish, then added one final sentence. "Nobody here is going to beat you for losing a war." A few Germans laughed bitterly. Others stared at the floor. Vogel kept his eyes on the officer's face. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't the face of a man delighted by an enemy's humiliation. It was a man doing a job. The voyage across the Atlantic mirrored the one Vogel had taken 4 years earlier when he'd traveled to Africa with Rommel's Corps. But everything about this ship felt larger, newer, cleaner. It wasn't a rusted hulk pressed into desperate service. It was a piece of machinery still humming at full power. On the third day, during brief time on deck, Vogel leaned on the rail and stared at grey water. Hesse spoke quietly beside him. "They could have sunk us in the harbour, called it an accident. No one in Germany would ever know. Instead, they feed us and take us across an ocean already full of their own transports." "Propaganda," Vogel said. "They want us to go home someday and talk about their soft hearts." Hesse shook his head. They don't know your name or mine. We're numbers on a list. This isn't theatre for us. This is procedure for them. Vogel didn't answer. But that night, lying on his bunk in dim light, he thought about the word procedure. He thought about millions of pages of orders he'd signed in his life. Some had sent men to the front. Some had crossed desks where nobody asked if this was right. After 2 weeks, land appeared again. This time, instead of jagged European coast, it was a wide, flat shore lined with docks, warehouses, and more cranes than Vogel had ever seen in one place: Norfolk, Virginia. The heat hit them first when they disembarked. The Americans handed each prisoner a small parcel as he passed: a cardboard box containing soap, a towel, a toothbrush, a razor, and a bar of chocolate. "Chocolate?" Vogel repeated. The interpreter shrugged. "Standard issue. Welcome to America, General." The journey inland took days. The trucks moved in long columns along highways that looked absurdly broad. They rolled past gas stations with neon signs, past neat farmhouses with cars in driveways, past fields so large that a German estate would have fit into one corner. Later, standing in line for food, Vogel watched a cook heaping mashed potatoes and green beans onto metal trays. There was meat. There was coffee that tasted like coffee. "Same as the enlisted men," the guard answered. Vogel took the tray. That night, one of the younger generals exploded. "This is all a trick," General Kruger declared. "They want us to collaborate." Vogel looked up. "Is it not?" he asked. "Pointless?" Kruger glared. "You speak like a defeated man." The trucks rolled on the next day. Mile after mile, Vogel saw bridges intact, factories with all their windows, train yards full of rolling stock. He'd come expecting to measure weapons. What he saw instead was a country still building tractors, washing machines, and chocolate. When the convoy turned toward barbed wire and guard towers, Vogel had realized one brutal fact: Germany had never really understood what it was fighting. The gate swung open. "Welcome to your new home," the officer said. Vogel believed him. The first surprise inside Camp Helena was the library. Vogel discovered it the second week while being marched to the shower block. Between the barracks and kitchen stood a low building with large windows and a sign: Recreation Hall. Library. Books were a weakness he'd never fully confessed to. He'd smuggled volumes into trenches in the First World War. He'd hidden philosophy and banned novels behind official reports in the Second. Now the idea that there might be something to read tugged at him. The American guard noticed him looking. "You can use it in the afternoon," the guard said in clumsy German. 2 hours, General. Yes, you get same rules as everyone." That afternoon, Vogel went. Inside stood wooden tables, a ping-pong table, and shelves of books. Most were in English, but there was a section in German. A German lieutenant acted as librarian. "Who provided these?" Vogel asked. "The Americans," the man replied. "They say keeping prisoners busy prevents trouble." Around the room, officers sat over chessboards and novels. Vogel picked a book at random, a German translation of Mark Twain. He opened it and found himself transported somewhere other than a staff map or a ruined town. Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn weren't propaganda. They were children, mocking authority, bending rules. When he closed the book, the camp looked a fraction smaller. Over the next weeks, Camp Helena revealed itself bit by bit. The food remained consistent. There was work, but not the kind designed to break men. Officers taught classes. Enlisted men worked farms. One morning, Vogel watched prisoners return, carrying sacks of corn and trays of eggs. "They pay us," one said. "They say the convention allows it." Vogel read the Geneva Convention that afternoon. The Americans were doing exactly what was written. Not all Germans reacted the same way. General Kruger muttered about humiliation. Others adapted. Colonel Lamers studied English and baseball rules. "Here, criticism isn't betrayal," he said. "We were told a system like this couldn't fight, and yet here we are." The windows of his apartment looked out on new concrete instead of ruins. There were cars in the streets again. Children laughed in courtyards instead of hiding in cellars. He lived two lives at once, retired officer of honorable captivity and prisoner still watching corn elevators rise. Now the government was asking him to choose. The letter was from the new defense ministry, polite and careful. The message was simple. The Federal Republic needed an army. The old enemy in the East had become the new threat. They wanted him back. He read the letter over and over, then walked to the window. Boys were kicking a ball against a wall. One wore a baseball cap with an American insignia. On his bookshelf stood a thin notebook from Camp Helena, filled with notes he'd written so he wouldn't forget. He opened it. Here was the library. Here American magazines criticizing their own government. Here a guard arguing with his sergeant and not punished because the sergeant had been wrong. On a page dated June 1945 were 8 words. Power that restrains itself is the rarest kind. Kruger had died hissing about betrayal. Lamers had converted to democracy. Others drifted in between. What stayed with all of them wasn't chocolate or showers. It was that their captors had chosen not to use all the power they possessed. Now his own country was asking for power again. Tanks, planes, uniforms, rank. Vogel knew how easily power slipped its leash. He visited old comrades. Some agreed to serve. "We can shape this force," Lamers said. "We can do it differently this time." Others refused. Major Hesse said, "I won't wear a uniform again." Vogel argued it wasn't the same state. "The cloth changed," Hesse replied. "The men didn't. Who will profit if we build this army, and who will pay if it goes wrong?" That night, he sat at his desk. The letter lay beside the notebook. He thought of a guard who'd shared cigarettes and reported himself. "Because the rules apply to me too." Vogel wrote his reply. "I cannot in good conscience help build an army unless it is firmly under laws stronger than any man." He signed his name at the bottom. The next morning he mailed the letter. Years later, when students asked him what he remembered most about the war, he never spoke of battles or strategies. He spoke instead of a moment on a ship crossing the Atlantic, watching the wake spread behind them in white foam, realizing that he wasn't being taken to punishment, but to a country that truly believed that even enemies deserved rules. That's what power looked like when it restrained itself. Not weakness, not softness, just the rarest and most dangerous kind of strength. The kind that chose mercy when it could have chosen anything else.